The relationship of miracles and revelation. Remember the point about miracles as a means of organizing different levels of consciousness. Miracles come from the subconscious, below conscious level. Revelations come from the above conscious level. The conscious level is in between and reacts to either sub- or superconscious impulses in varying ratios. Freud was right about the classification, but not the names. He was also right that the content of consciousness is fleeting. Consciousness is the level which engages in the world, and is capable of responding to both external and internal impulses. Having no impulses from itself, and being primarily a mechanism for inducing response, it can be very wrong. For example, if the identification is with the body, consciousness may distort superconscious impulses by denying their source, and seeking their impact in the orgasm. This is the result of the mistaken identity confusion. If you will look back at the description of the effects of revelation, you will see that there are some similarities in the experiential results, but hardly in the content. This and preceding paragraph go later. Revelations induce complete but temporary suspension of doubt and fear. They represent the original form of communication between God and his souls, before the intrusion of fire and ice made this impossible. It should be noted that they involve an extremely personal sense of closeness to creation, which man tries to find in sexual relationships. This confusion is responsible for the depression and fear which are often associated with sex. Sex is often associated with lack of love, but revelation is purely a love experience. Physical closeness cannot achieve this. As was said before, the subconscious impulses properly induce miracles, which are interpersonal, and result in closeness to others. This can be misunderstood by a personally willful consciousness as an impulse towards sexual gratification. The revelation unites souls directly with God. The miracle unites souls directly with each other. Neither emanates from consciousness, but both are experienced there. This is essential, because consciousness is the state which produces action, though it does not inspire it. Man is free to believe what he chooses. What he does attests to what he believes. The deeper levels of his subconscious always contain the impulse to miracles, but he is free to fill its superficial levels, which are closer to consciousness, with the impulses of this world and to identify himself with them. This results in denying himself access to the miracle level underneath. In conscious actions, then, his interpersonal relationships also become superficial, and miracle-inspired relating becomes impossible. 25. Miracles are a way of earning release from fear. Revelation induces a state in which fear has already been abolished. Miracles are thus a means, and revelations are an end. In this sense, they work together. Tell Bill that miracles do not depend on revelation. They induce it. He is quite capable of miracles already, but he is still too fearful for revelations. Note that your Helen revelation occurred specifically after you had engaged at the visionary level in a process of denying fear. Revelation is intensely personal, and is actually not translatable into conscious content at all. That is why any attempt to describe it in words is usually incomprehensible, even to the writer himself at another time. This is why the Book of Revelations is essentially incomprehensible. Revelation induces only experience. Miracles, on the other hand, induce interpersonal action. In the end, these are more useful, because of their impersonal nature. In this phase of learning, working miracles is more valuable because freedom from fear cannot be thrust upon you. The experience cannot last. Tell Bill that your propensity for revelations, which is very great, is the result of a high level of past communion. Its transitory nature comes from the descent into fear, which has not yet been overcome. His own suspended state mitigates both extremes. This has been very apparent in the course of both of your recent developmental patterns. Miracles are the essential course of action for both of you. They will strengthen him and stabilize you. Note that the much more personal than usual notes you are taking today reflect the revelatory experience. This does not produce the more generalizable quality which this course is aimed at. They may, nevertheless, be of great help to Bill personally, since you asked for something that would help him personally. It depends on how he listens, and how well he understands the cooperative nature of your joint experience. You can help only by reading this note first. Ask him later if this should be included in the written part of the course at all, or whether you should keep these notes separately. He is in charge of these decisions. Tell Bill he should try to understand the very important difference between Christ's control and Christ's guidance. This is what made him fearful yesterday. 26. Miracles praise God through men. They praise God by honoring His creations, affirming their perfection. They heal because they denied body identification and affirmed soul identification. By perceiving the Spirit, they adjust the levels and see them in proper alignment. This places the Spirit at the center, where souls can communicate directly. 27. Miracles should inspire gratitude, not all. Man should thank God for what he really is. The children of God are very holy. The miracle honors their holiness. God's creations cannot lose their holiness, although it can be hidden. The miracle uncovers it, and brings it into the light where it belongs. Holiness can never be really hidden in darkness, but man can deceive himself on this point. This illusion makes him fearful, because in his heart he knows it is an illusion. Like all illusions, he exerts enormous efforts to establish their validity. The miracle sets validity where it belongs. Eternal validity belongs only to the soul. The miracle acknowledges only the truth. It thus dispels man's illusions about himself, and puts him into communion with himself and with God. Christ inspires all miracles, which are essentially intercessions. They intercede for man's holiness, and make him holy. They place man beyond the physical laws, and raise him into the sphere of celestial order. In this order, man is perfect. The soul never loses its communion with God. Only the mind and body need atonement. The miracle joins in the atonement of Christ by placing the mind in the service of the Spirit. This establishes the proper function of mind, and abolishes its errors. 28. Miracles honor man, because he is lovable. They dispel illusions about himself, and perceive the light in him. They thus atone for his errors by freeing him from his own nightmares. They release him from a prison in which he has imprisoned himself. By freeing his mind from illusions, they restore his sanity, and place him at the feet of Jesus. Biblical quotation relates to the healing of a devil-possessed man, in which the sufferer was subsequently found healed, in his right mind, and sitting at feet of Jesus. Helen note. Tell Bill man's mind can be possessed by illusions, but his spirit is eternally free. If a mind creates without love, it can create an empty shell. This can be possessed by evil. But the atonement restores the soul to its proper place. Unless there is emptiness, there is no danger, and emptiness is a false creation. The mind that serves the Spirit is invulnerable. 29. The miracle restores the soul to its fullness. By atoning for lack, it establishes perfect protection. The strength of the soul leaves no room for intrusions. The forgiven are filled with the soul, and their soul forgives in return. It is the duty of the released to release their brothers. The forgiven are the means of atonement. Those released by Christ must join in releasing their brothers, for this is the plan of atonement. 30. Miracles are the way in which minds that serve the Spirit unite with Christ for the salvation or release of all God's creations. Aside, Helen commented on awakening with the phrase God is not mocked with anticipation of punishment. Interpretation: God is not mocked was intended as reassurance. You are afraid that what you wrote last night was contradictory, conflicting with some earlier points, especially because you were writing while you were all doped up. Remember, God is not mocked under any circumstances. Contradictions in my words mean lack of understanding, or scribal failures, which I make every effort to correct. But they are still not crucial. The Bible has the same problem, I assure you, and it's still being edited. Consider the power of my word, in that it has withstood all the attacks of error, and is the source of truth. Tell Bill that there are certain advantages in being a psychologist. A major one is the understanding of projection and the extent of its results. Possession is very closely related to projection. Lucifer could be literally translated light bearer. He literally projected himself from heaven. Projection still has this hurling connotation, because it involves hurling something you do not want, and regard as dangerous and frightening, to someone else. This is the opposite of the golden rule, and having placed this rule upside down, the reverse of miracles, or projection, follows automatically. The correction lies in accepting what is true in yourself, by bringing all that you are into light. Helen fearful of writing next part. Casey was wrong about possession, and he was also wrong about hurting himself. One of the major problems with miracle workers is that they are so sure that what they are doing is right, because they know it stems from love, that they do not pause to let me establish my limits. While what Casey, did came from me, he could not be induced to ask me each time whether I wanted him to perform this particular miracle. If he had, he would not have performed any miracles that could not get through constructively, and would thus have saved himself unnecessary strain. He burned himself out with indiscriminate miracles, and to this extent did not fulfill his own full purpose, and was also subject to the scribal error I mentioned at the start. The disciples were also prone to this. The answer is never perform a miracle without asking me if you should. This spares you from exhaustion, and because you act under direct communication the trance becomes unnecessary. Because miracles are expressions of love, it does not follow that they will always be effective. I am the only one who can perform miracles indiscriminately, because I am the atonement. You have a role in atonement, which I will dictate to you. Remember, you already have a point about the involuntary nature of miracles. We also have established the fact that everything involuntary belongs under Christ's control, not under yours. Under Christ's control, miracles replenish the doer as well as the receiver. Possession really means not under Christ's control, thus making him, the mind, vulnerable to projection. The reference to the earthbound entering bodies really refer to the taking over by their own earthbound thoughts. This is demon possession. After all, Lucifer fell, but he was still an angel. He is thus the symbol for man. Atonement is the knowledge that the belief that angels can fall is false. It is true that mind can create projections as well as miracles, but it's not true that projections are real. Any psychologist should understand this. This is what is meant by the truth shall set you free. Christ-controlled miracles are part of the atonement, but Christ's guidance is personal, and leads to personal salvation. The impersonal nature of miracles is an essential ingredient, because this enables me to control their distribution as I see fit. Christ's guidance, on the other hand, leads to the highly personal experience of revelation. This is why it involves personal choice. A guide does not control by definition, but he does direct, leaving the following up to you. Lead us not into temptation means guide us out of our own errors. Note that the word is lead, not order. Take up thy cross and follow me should be interpreted to read recognize your errors and choose to abandon them by following my guidance. Tell Bill when he is afraid of possession, he need only remember that error cannot really threaten truth, which always can withstand its assaults. Only the error is really vulnerable. The princes of this world are princes only because they are really angels. But they are free to establish their kingdom where they see fit. If you will remember that all princes inherit their power from the Father, the right choice becomes inevitable. The soul is in a state of grace forever. Man's reality is only his soul. Therefore, man is in a state of grace forever. Atonement undoes all errors in this respect, and thus uproots the real source of fear. If you will check back at the reference to uprooting, you will understand it better in this context. Tell Bill that whenever God's reassurances are experienced as threat, it is always because man is defending his misplaced and misdirected love and loyalty. That is what projection always involves. Casting spells merely means affirming error. And error is lack of love. When man projects this onto others, he does imprison them, but only to the extent that he reinforces errors they have already made. This distortion makes them vulnerable to the curse of others, since they have already cursed themselves. The miracle worker can only bless, and this undoes the curse and frees the soul from prison. Tell Bill that his slip about rivet should be noted. Some slips reach consciousness from the unchrist-controlled subconscious, and betray a lack of love. But others' slips come from the superconscious, which is in communion with God, and which can also break into consciousness. His slip, rivet, was an expression of a soul gaining enough strength to request freedom from prison. It will ultimately demand it. Special revelation for Helen. You are wholly lovely. A perfect shaft of pure light. Before your loveliness the stars stand transfixed, and bow to the power of your will. What do children know of their creation, except what their Creator tells them? You were created above the angels because your role involves creation as well as protection. You, who are in the image of the Father, need bow only to Him, before whom I kneel with you. Note, this revelation was permitted because you did not project onto Bill the blame for your omission to ask me if you should transcribe the notes. The fact that he should have done so does not exempt you from your own omission. Thanks for blessing him with a miracle rather than cursing him with projection. Note further, he needn't feel concerned about it either, so he forgot. It happens all the time, until the habit of asking becomes involuntary. Helen meeting with Dr. Wise and Dr. Damrosch. Dr. Damrosch permitted an opportunity for questioning in his capacity as chairman of the flu board for asking regarding Bill's flu shot. This was an example of how miracles should work. You did not jump into the question yourself, and even though you did rush for the phone on Red's advice, you exerted no pressure on Bill's reluctance. This gave me a chance to let you leave it to the real expert, whom I sent to answer the question. (31) Miracles are examples of right thinking. Reality contact at all levels becomes strong and accurate, thus permitting correct delineation of intra- and interpersonal boundaries. As a result, the doer sees the truth as God created it. This is what is meant by the point on perspective adjustment. 32. A miracle is a correction factor introduced into false thinking by me. It acts as a catalyst, shaking up erroneous perception and snapping it into place. This correction factor places man under the atonement principle, where his perception is healed. Until this has occurred, perception of the divine order is impossible. True depth perception becomes possible only at the highest order of perceptual integration. The spiritual eye is the mechanism of miracles, because what the spiritual eye perceives is truth. The spiritual eye perceives both the creations of God and the creations of man. Among the creations of man, it can also separate the true from the false by its ability to perceive totally, rather than selectively. It thus becomes the proper instrument for reality testing, which always involves the necessary distinction between the true and the false. 33. The miracle dissolves error because the spiritual eye identifies error as false or unreal. This is the same as saying that, by seeing light, darkness automatically disappears. Darkness is lack of light. It does not have unique properties of its own. It is an example of the scarcity fallacy, from which only error can proceed. Truth is always abundant. Those who perceive and acknowledge that they have everything have no need for driven behavior of any kind. Helen has other personal material related to this regarding pregnancy. 34. Miracles are a blessing from parents to children. This is just another way of phrasing the previous point about from those who have more to those who have less. Children do not belong to parents, but they do need to share their greater abundance. If they are deprived, their perception becomes distorted. When this occurs, the whole family of God, or the sonship, is impaired in its relationships. Ultimately, every member of the family of God must return. The miracle calls to him to return, because it blesses and honors him even though he may be absent in spirit. 35. The miracle acknowledges all men as your brothers and mine. It is a way of perceiving the universal mark of God in them. Tell Bill that this is the true strawberry mark of brotherhood. This is just a sign of special concern for him, because he keeps worrying about this. You might add that his false idea about his own exclusion from universal love is fallacious in your terms, and arrogant in his. His real specialness does not stem from exclusion, but from inclusion. All my brothers are special. He should stop interpreting this as all except Bill. This is ridiculous. Tell him that the implied lack of love that his version contains is way off the mark, and misses the level of right thinking entirely. He must heal his perception in this respect. He must work a miracle on behalf of himself here. See the point about miracles as a perception corrector, before he can effect miracles as creative energizers, which they are. Tell Bill that 50 million Frenchmen can be wrong, because the notion is too fragmented. What can't be wrong is the universal sonship of which he is a part. God would be mocked if any of his creations lacked holiness. The creation is whole. The mark of wholeness is holiness, not holes. The sonship has no holes anywhere. 36. Wholeness is the perceptual content of the miracle. It thus corrects, or atones for, the faulty perception of lack. We now turn to the fundamental distinction between miracles and projection. The stimulus must precede the response, and must also determine, influence, the kind of response that is evoked. The relationships of S and R are extremely intimate. The behavioristic terminology is because this part deals with behavior. Behavior is response, so that the question response to what becomes crucial. Stimuli of all kinds are identified through perception. You perceive the stimulus and behave accordingly. It follows then that, as ye perceive, so will ye behave. Helen raises point that biblical language is hardly behavioristic terminology. Answer: no, but they needn't be out of accord with each other either. Consider the golden rule again. You are asked to behave towards others as you would have them behave toward you. This means that the perception of both must be accurate, since the golden rule is the order for appropriate behavior. You can't behave appropriately unless you perceive accurately, because appropriate behavior depends on lack of level confusion. The presence of level confusion always results in variable reality testing, and hence variability in behavioral appropriateness. All forms of self-image debasement are fundamental perceptual distortions. They inevitably produce either self-contempt or projection, and usually both. Since you and your neighbor are equal members of the same family, as you perceive both, so will you behave toward both. The way to perceive for golden rule behavior is to look out from the perception of your own holiness and perceive the holiness of others. Bill and you need considerable clarification of the channel role. Look carefully at Mrs. Albert. She is working miracles every day, because she knows who she is. I emphasize again that your tendency to forget names is not hostility, but a fear of involvement or recognition. You had misinterpreted human encounters as opportunities for magic rather than for miracles, and so you tried to protect the name. This is a very ancient and primitive way of trying to protect a person. Note, the very old Jewish practice of changing the name of a person who is very ill, so that when the list is given to the angel of death, the person with that name will not be found. This is a good example of the curiously literal regression which can occur in very bright people when they become afraid. You and Bill both do it. Actually, it is a device closely related to the phobia, in the sense that they both narrow fear to a simple aspect of a much larger problem in order to enable them to avoid it. A similar mechanism works when you get furious about a comparatively minor expression by someone to whom you are ambivalent. A good example of this is your response to Jonathan, who does leave things around in very strange ways. Actually, he does this because he thinks that by minor areas of disorganization he can protect his stability. I remind you that you have done this yourself for years, and should understand it very well. This should be met with great charity, rather than with great fury. The fury comes from your awareness that you do not love Jonathan as you should, and you narrow your lack of love by centering your hate on trivial behavior in an attempt to protect him from it. You also call him Jonathan for the same reason, see previous reference. Note that a name is a human symbol that stands for a person. Superstitions about names are very common for just that reason. That is also why people sometimes respond with anger when their names are spelled or pronounced incorrectly. Actually, the Jewish superstition about changing the names was a distortion of a revelation about how to alter or avert death. What the revelation's proper content was, that those who change their mind, not name, about destruction or hate do not need to die. Death is a human affirmation of a belief in hate. That is why the Bible says, "There is no death." And that is why I demonstrated that death does not exist. Remember that I came to fulfill the law by reinterpreting it. The law itself, if properly understood, offers only protection to man. Those who have not yet changed their minds have entered the hellfire concept into it. Remember, I said before that because nature abhors a vacuum, it does not follow that the vacuum is filled with hellfire. The emptiness engendered by fear should be replaced by love, because love and its absence are in the same dimension, and correction cannot be undertaken except within a dimension. Otherwise, there has been a confusion of levels. Returning to Mrs. Albert, not Andrews. She corrected your error about her name without embarrassment, and without hostility, because she has not made your own mistake about names. She is not afraid, because she knows she is protected. She made the correction only because you were inaccurate, and the whole question of embarrassment did not occur to her. She was also quite unembarrassed when she told you that everything has to be done to preserve life, because you never can tell when God may come and say, "Get up, Dave." And then he will. She did not ask what you believed first, and afterwards merely added, "And it's true, too." The right answer to the SCT item is, when they told me what to do, I referred the question to the only real authority. Helen, note, if you ask somebody what he believes before you tell him what you believe, then you are implying that you will say what he approves. This is not the real authority. You took a lot of notes on, "Those who are ashamed of me before men, them will I be ashamed of before God." This was rather carefully clarified, even though the quotation is not quite right, but it doesn't matter. The important thing is that elsewhere in the Bible it also says, "Those who represent or plead for me to men will be represented, or pleaded for, by me before God." Note, this quotation is also not the correct biblical phrasing, but it is what it means. Note that one who represents also witnesses for. The quotation thus means that you represent or witness for the authority in whom you believe. Your witnessing demonstrates your belief, and thus strengthens it. I assure you that I will witness for anyone who lets me, and to whatever extent he himself permits it. Those who witness for me are expressing, through their miracles, that they have abandoned deprivation in favor of the abundance they have learned belongs to them. 37. A major contribution of miracles is their strength in releasing man from his misplaced sense of isolation, deprivation, and lack. They are affirmations of sonship, which is a state of completion and abundance. Bill's very proper emphasis on changing your mind needs clarification. Whatever is true and real is eternal, and cannot change or be changed. The soul is therefore unalterable because it is already perfect, but the mind can elect the level it chooses to serve. The only limit which is put on its choice is that it cannot serve two masters. While the ballot itself is a secret one, and the right to vote is fully protected, voting always entails both election and rejection. If two candidates are voted for the same position, the machine cancels the ballot automatically. This is necessary, because a split vote does not represent any real allegiance. Free will is the attribute of the mind, not the soul. The soul always remains changeless, because it never leaves the sight of God. The creation of the soul is already fully accomplished. The mind, if it votes to do so, becomes a medium by which the soul can create along the line of its own creation. If it does not freely elect to do so, it retains this creative ability, but places itself under tyrannous rather than authoritative control. As a result, what it creates is imprisonment, because such are the dictates of tyrants. To change your mind means to place it at the disposal of true authority. The miracle is thus a sign that the mind has elected to be guided by Christ in His service. The abundance of Christ is the natural result of choosing to follow Him. P.S. The reason you have been late recently for work, because you were taking dictation, is merely because you didn't remember to ask me when to stop. This is an example of the indiscriminate or uncontrolled miracle working we already spoke of. It is well meant but ill-advised. I prompted that call from Jack, taxi man couldn't pick Helen up, etc., to show you that this is not necessary. Also, the other man needed the money more today. Note that you managed to fill your scribal role with no interruptions, and were also on time. Note also that you closed the book and put it aside without consulting me. Ask, is that all? Answer, no. Add the following: these notes are serving, among other things, to replace the handwriting on the wall which you once saw next to your own altar, which read, "You have been weighed in the balance and found wanting." Scribes must learn Christ's control, to replace their former habits, which did produce scarcity rather than abundance. From errors of this kind, the sense of deprivation is inevitable, but very easily corrected. The following is in relation to question about sex. Tell Bill, the one more river, is related to sex. You might even explain it to him as a tidal wave, a term which he will understand. You won't. Both of you are involved with unconscious distortions, above the miracle level, which are producing a dense cover over miracle impulses which makes it hard for them to reach consciousness. Sex and miracles are both ways of relating. The nature of any interpersonal relationship is limited or defined by what you want it to do, which is why you want it in the first place. Relating is a way of achieving an outcome. Indiscriminate sexual impulses resemble indiscriminate miracle impulses in that both result in body image misperceptions. The first is an expression of an indiscriminate attempt to reach communion through the body. This involves not only the improper self-identification, but also disrespect for the individuality of others. Self-control is not the whole answer to this problem, though I am by no means discouraging its use. It must be understood, however, that the underlying mechanism must be uprooted, a word you both should understand well enough by now not to regard it as frightening. All shallow roots have to be uprooted, because they are not deep enough to sustain you. The illusion that shallow roots can be deepened and thus made to hold is one of the corollaries on which the reversal of the golden rule, referred to twice before, is balanced. As these false underpinnings are uprooted, or given up, equilibrium is experienced as unstable. But the fact is that nothing is less stable than an orientation which is upside down. Anything that holds it this way is hardly conducive to greater stability. The whole danger of defenses lies in their propensity to hold misperceptions rigidly in place. This is why rigidity is regarded as stability by those who are off the mark. Note: the only final solution. No, Helen, this has nothing to do with the Nazi use of the term. You just got frightened again. One of the more horrible examples of inverted or upside-down thinking, and history is full of horrible examples of this, is the fact that the Nazis spelled their appalling error with capital letters. I shed many tears over this, but it is by no means the only time I said, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do." All actions which stem from reverse thinking are literally the behavioral expressions of those who know not what they do. Actually, Jean Dixon was right in her emphasis on feet on the ground and fingertips in the heaven, though she was a bit too literal for your kind of understanding. Many people knew exactly what she meant, so her statement was the right miracle for them. For you and Bill, it would be better to consider the concept in terms of reliability and validity. A rigid orientation can be extremely reliable, even if it is upside down. In fact, the more consistently upside down it is, the more reliable it is, because consistency always held up better mathematically than test-retest comparisons, which were always on shaky ground. You can check this against Jack's notes if you wish, but I assure you it's true. split-half reliability, is statistically a much stronger approach. The reason for this is that correlation, which is the technique applied to test-retest comparisons, measures only the extent of association, and does not consider the direction at all. But two halves of the same thing must go in the same direction, if there is to be accuracy of measurement. This simple statement is really the principle on which split-half reliability, a means of estimating internal consistency, rests. Note, however, that both approaches leave out a very important dimension. Internal consistency criteria disregard time, because the focus is on one-time measurements. Test-retest comparisons are based on time intervals, but they disregard direction. It is possible, of course, to use both, by establishing internal consistency and stability over time. You will remember that Jack once told his class that the more sophisticated statisticians are concentrating more and more on reliability, rather than validity. The rationale for this, as he said, was that a reliable instrument does measure something. He also said, however, that validity is still the ultimate goal, which reliability can only serve. I submit, I'm using Jack's language in this section, because it always had a special meaning for you. So did Jack. Your confusion of sex and statistics is an interesting example of this whole issue. Note that night you spent in the scent of roses doing a complex factorial analysis of covariance. It's a funny story to others, because they see a different kind of level confusion than the one you yourself were making. You might recall that you wanted that design, and Jack opposed it. One of the real reasons why that evening was so exhilarating was because it represented a battle of intellects, both good ones by the way, each communicating exceptionally clearly but on opposite sides. The sexual aspects were naturally touched off in both of you, because of the sex and aggression confusion. It is especially interesting that after the battle ended with your agreeing with Jack, he wrote in the margin of your notes, "Virtue is triumphant." Helen note regarding submission-dominance, feminine-masculine roles, entered into this. While this remark was funny to both of you at the time, you might consider its truer side. The virtue lay in the complete respect each of you offered to the other's intellect. Your mutual sexual attraction was also shared. The error lay in the word, triumphant. This had the battle connotation, because either of you was respecting all of the other. There is a great deal more to a person than intellect and genitals. The omission was the soul. I submit, after a long interruption, that if a mind, soul, is in valid relationship with God, it can't be upside down. Jack and the other very eminent methodologists have abandoned validity in favor of reliability because they have lost sight of the end and are concentrating on the means. Remember the story about the artist who kept devoting himself to inventing better and better ways of sharpening pencils. He never created anything, but he had the sharpest pencil in town. The language here is intentional. Sex is often utilized on behalf of very similar errors. Hostility, triumph, vengeance, self-debasement, and all sort of expressions of the lack of love are often very clearly seen in the accompanying fantasies. But it is a profound error to imagine that, because these fantasies are so frequent, or occur so reliably, that this implies validity. Remember that while validity implies reliability, the relationship is not reversible. You can be wholly reliable, and entirely wrong. While a reliable test does measure something, what use is the test unless you discover what the something is? And if validity is more important than reliability, and is also necessarily implied by it, why not concentrate on validity, and let reliability fall naturally into place? Intellect may be a displacement upward, but sex can be a displacement outward. How can man come close to others through the parts of him which are really invisible? The word invisible means cannot be seen or perceived. What cannot be perceived is hardly the right means for improving perception. The confusion of miracle impulse with sexual impulse is a major source of perceptual distortion, because it induces, rather than straightening out the basic level confusion which underlies all those who seek happiness with the instruments of the world. A desert is a desert is a desert. You can do anything you want in it, but you cannot change it from what it is. It still lacks water, which is why it is a desert. Bring up that dream about the bluebird. While Helen was looking for this dream, she came across another. The message was to bring both, as an excellent example of how extremely good Helen had become over the intervening 25 years at sharpening pencils. Note that the essential content hasn't changed, it's just better written. The thing to do with a desert is to leave. 38. Miracles arise from a miraculous state of mind. By being one. This state of mind goes out to anyone, even without the awareness of the miracle worker himself. The impersonal nature of miracles is because atonement itself is one, uniting all creations with their creator. 39. The miracle is an expression of an inner awareness of Christ and acceptance of his atonement. The mind is then in a state of grace, and naturally becomes gracious, both to the host within and the stranger without. By bringing in the stranger, he becomes your brother. The miracles you are told not to perform have not lost their value. They are still expressions of your own state of grace, but the action aspect of the miracle should be Christ-controlled, because of his complete awareness of the whole plan. The impersonal nature of miracle-mindedness ensures your own grace, but only Christ is in a position to know where grace can be bestowed. 40. A miracle is never lost. It touches many people you may not even know, and sometimes produces undreamed-of changes and forces of which you are not even aware. This is not your concern. It will also always bless you. This is not your concern either. But it is the concern of the record. The record is completely unconcerned with reliability, being perfectly valid because of the way it was set up. It always measures what it was supposed to measure. I want to finish the instructions about sex, because this is an area the miracle worker must understand. Inappropriate sex drives, or misdirected miracle impulses, result in guilt, if expressed, and depression, if denied. We said before that all real pleasure comes from doing God's will. Whenever it is not done, an experience of lack results. This is because not doing the will of God is a lack of self. Sex was intended as an instrument for physical creation to enable souls to embark on new chapters in their experience, and thus improve their record. The pencil was not an end in itself. See earlier section. It was an aid to the artist in his own creative endeavors. As he made new homes for souls and guided them through the period of their own developmental readiness, he learned the role of the Father himself. The whole process was set up as a learning experience in gaining grace. The pleasure which is derived from sex as such is reliable only because it stems from an error which men shared. Awareness of the error produces the guilt. Denial of the error results in projection. Correction of the error brings release. The only valid use of sex is procreation. It is not truly pleasurable in itself. Lead us not into temptation. Means do not let us deceive ourselves into believing that we can relate in peace to God or our brothers with anything external. The sin of Onan was called a sin because it involved a related type of self-delusion, namely, that pleasure without relating can exist. To repeat an earlier instruction, the concept of either the self or another as a sex object epitomizes this strange reversal. As Bill put it, and very correctly too, it is objectionable, but only because it is invalid. Upside-down logic produces this kind of thinking. Child of God, you were created to create the good, the beautiful, and the holy. Do not lose sight of this. You were right in telling Bill to invite me to enter anywhere temptation arises. I will change the situation from one of inappropriate sexual attraction to one of impersonal miracle working. The concept of changing the channel for libidinal expression is Freud's greatest contribution, except that he did not understand what channel really means. The love of God, for a little while, must still be expressed through one body to another. That is because the real vision is still so dim. Everyone can use his body best by enlarging man's perception, so he can see the real vision. This vision is invisible to the physical eye. The ultimate purpose of the body is to render itself unnecessary. Learning to do this is the only real reason for its creation. Note, Scribes have a particular role in the plan of atonement, because they have the ability to experience revelations themselves, and also to put into words enough of the experience to serve as a basis for miracles. This refers to experiences at the visionary level, after which Helen wrote, "If you will tell me what to do, I will to do it." She had not known that the word "to" was inserted, and had merely intended to write, "I will do it." This recognition had a terrific impact on Helen,